Thank you very much, Dr. Norton, and thank you all very much for being here. I've had the pleasure of spending a few hours on campus today. Met with a few students, Abby and JD who are here tonight. I was, as you might imagine, if you know Abby and JD, very impressed, and I know they represent the student body, and you have a special mission here, and it's really just great to be here. So I am honored to be a part of this program, to be at the Hastert Center, and to give some remarks on this subject matter. As Dr. Norton said, I've been asked to speak today about some of the challenges in energy policy and government regulation, and I will try to do this at a level that conveys in relatively simple form some basic truisms from our vantage point with regard to energy policy. But I encourage you at the end of this to ask any questions that you would like to. Before I begin, let me tell you a little bit about our company, Exelon. As Dr. Norton indicated, we are one of the leading utilities in the country. We actually have a series of businesses. We own 3 delivery companies, which are the people to whom you customarily pay your utility bill. That's Commonwealth Edison in northern Illinois. Up here, oops, I'm technologically challenged. Let me see, and there we go. Commonwealth Edison in northern Illinois, and then Pico Electric, which is in the Philadelphia area, and Baltimore Gas and Electric, which is in Maryland. We provide electricity to about 6.5 million customers through those 3 businesses. We are also one of the largest generators of electricity in the country and the largest nuclear power plant operator in the United States with 22 reactors, the 3rd largest in the world. We're also the 11th largest wind company in the United States, the largest generator of low-carbon electricity. In total, in terms of, if you're familiar with the measurements, we have about 42,000 megawatts of electricity that we generate. 19,000 are nuclear, 10,000 are gas, 3,000 are renewable. We operate in 47 states, Washington, D.C., and 2 Canadian provinces. Our assets of the company in total, it's a large company, are $74 billion, $33 billion in revenue, 27,000 employees. And we are the largest company that is totally committed to competitive markets for electricity and totally dependent on the prices that we get from those markets for our financial well-being. So let me turn with that as background, and it will inform much of what I say to energy policy. And I'm going to focus on energy policy in the electricity sector, not in the transportation sector, because obviously, while there are some overlaps in terms of electric cars and the like, and you'll hear some additional overlaps, I'll focus on electricity that is provided to businesses and residences. For the last 40 years, we have not had a comprehensive energy policy for really any types of energy, from electricity to transportation fuels. We came very close a couple of years ago with the American Clean Energy and Security Act, which came within a few votes of passing Congress, that would have addressed carbon in all sectors. It's better known by some as the Cap and Trade Bill. But that was defeated. I fear that that is deep in the basement of the United States political machinery and is not likely to be resurrected anytime soon. So nowhere is the lack of comprehensive energy policy clearer than in the electric sector, which I will focus my remarks on. We do have energy policy ideas of sorts in the electric sector. And I like to classify these as we like what is sexy and we like what creates jobs. So when you see what is advocated out in the forum for the electricity, you look at enormous momentum for renewable energy, enormous momentum for the building of plants that will occasion construction jobs in the United States, given the economic situations that we're confronted with. But without any true plan, which we do not have, U.S. energy policy, both at the state and federal level, is really driven by what I would colloquially call a mess of mandates and subsidies without regard to the cost or economics for any type of energy fuel. There is a constant urge that we have to pick the sexy technology, to pick winners and losers regardless of their economic viability. And this piecemeal approach ultimately ends up hurting consumers rather than helping them by often picking the most costly options that do not, and not allowing the marketplace to work. whether it's new nuclear with loan guarantee programs, coal with carbon capture and sequestration, wind and solar with large subsidies. They're forced into the market through mandates that often force the most expensive generation options for consumers. Subsidies, make no mistake about it, cost taxpayers money and add to the federal debt. When we think of these sexy programs, it's interesting to contrast those with that cost. The Energy Information Administration has found that the federal government provided annually $37.2 billion in direct financial interventions and subsidies in energy markets. And some in Congress, without regard to cost, talk about doubling or tripling the size, for example, of the existing nuclear fleet to face our energy challenges. These plants are not currently economic, and I'll explain why in a minute. The government would have to spend between $300 and $600 billion to get those plants built. The states pile on to what the federal momentum is as well. Illinois and New Jersey, which are two prominent markets in which we operate, have considered or enacted legislation that will bring uneconomic generation into the market in the name of jobs. Let me give you an example here from in Illinois. The Senate passed a bill in the last session to build or to authorize the construction of a 602 megawatt integrated gas combined cycle coal plant in downstate Illinois called the Tenaska plant. Essentially, the way the bill would function is that utilities would be forced to enter into contracts to buy the output from this plant. So that would be, in essence, subsidizing the plant, guaranteeing the return on that plant to the investors in the plant. The cost to build the plant would be over $3 billion, assuming it stays on budget. And the legislature would force electric consumers, by enacting this legislation, to pay $400 million additionally each year to provide the same electricity relative to what current rates are. The total extra cost to consumers in Illinois of this plant, in the name of sexy carbon capture, which is questionable technologically, would be $12 billion without any guarantee that the plant would produce power for the full length of the contract. If you translate that down to what current rates are, this plant would cost consumers 9 times more than competitive electricity market prices today. Even the Illinois Commerce Commission has found the project features high cost to ratepayers with uncertain future benefits, and yet the project passes the Illinois Senate and faces the prospect of passage in the Illinois House in the coming months. New Jersey has enacted similar legislation to do similar things. Our view is, my view and that of Exelon is, these piecemeal attempts at energy policy in the name of jobs or in the name of what is sexy need to stop because they cause more harm than good. We view, while we don't have a comprehensive energy policy, we do view the policy objectives to be fairly clear. We want energy to be as clean as possible. We want it to be reliable, meaning that there is enough of it when we need it that is available, and we want it to be affordable. Now, there's a great deal of debate about how you get to those places. But what is very interesting, what I hope to demonstrate to you tonight, is that we can get there without a comprehensive legislative energy policy because we don't need one right now. And the reasons we don't need an energy policy right now to enact that are twofold. One is there has been a revolution in energy technology in the last 3 years, and that is the fracking technology from which we extract natural gas from shale. Natural gas prices, which is measured in MMBTU, dollars per MMBTU, a few short years ago were $12 per MMBTU. Natural gas prices, spot prices today were $2.25. What that means in terms of electricity prices is because natural gas as a fuel sits on the margin, meaning it defines the cost of electricity for or for a majority of the time, is that as gas prices go down dramatically for all electricity regardless of from where it is generated. This is a game changer, a revolutionary thing that has happened in the energy industry. So that's item one, the first building block for rational energy policy without legislative enactment. The second one is we are finally implementing the provisions of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act is 40 years old in the United States. It was renewed a few years ago near unanimously by Republicans and Democrats, and the EPA has enacted a series of regulations that will control air pollution. New gas finds mostly in shale gas, but in conventional supplies too, have dramatically increased our domestic natural gas supplies. The U.S. is now the world's largest producer of natural gas. Estimates by the Colorado School of Mines are that the total potential of U.S. gas supply increased by 71% in the last 10 years. Shale gas production used to be none of our composition of gas. It's 30% in the last 3 years, and it's expected to grow to 60%. And natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel. It emits approximately 80% less sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide per megawatt hour than coal. There are no mercury, no particulates, and 55% less carbon dioxide than coal. The natural gas industry also creates jobs, and there are a number of estimates that reflect that. And because low natural gas prices, we are beginning to see the return into the country of chemical companies like Dow that have announced plans to build facilities adjacent to natural gas resources. Inexpensive natural gas produces cheaper, cleaner electricity and is one of the keys to competitiveness. As I mentioned, the EPA is enforcing regulations now that will become fully in effect by the end of 2015. Not new or unexpected, but regulations that are implementing laws that have been the consensus in the nation for a long time. Now, one of the arguments you hear about the EPA laws, which will put restrictions on the emission of these particulates and the emission of these pollutants, is that they will kill coal, that coal has been such an enormous industry in the United States, and this will cause the coal industry to collapse. Coal can still operate consistent with these regulations, but what it needs is it needs the systems to clean the emissions, and those systems are chemically available, they're commercially available. 66% of the coal fleet in the United States already has installed or is in the process of installing the controls necessary for complete compliance. So what is happening as these rules become more eminent is that the smaller, older coal plants, the most pollutant-intensive coal plants, are retiring. Most of the plants that will retire, and 15% of the coal production in the United States is likely to retire under these regulations, are 50 years old or more, 150 megawatts in size or less. And to put that in comparison, a typical nuclear plant is about 1,000 megawatts. Because natural gas is cheap, because it will comply with the rules, with the EPA rules, it will do so less expensively. The existing natural gas fleet can cheaply accommodate the majority of these coal retirements. And so that is the framework upon which we look at this. Now, this is an enormously complicated area. And it's complicated not only by the science, not only by the technological development, but it's complicated by the politics. Because as you might imagine, there are certain areas in the nation that favor the natural gas development. There are certain that don't. They have policy arguments for it. They have rationalizations for it. They have constituencies that are there. The same thing with respect to coal. We initiated Exelon a few years ago, a plan which we call Exelon 2020. Exelon 2020 reinforces, and I'll explain it to you in a minute, the fact that there's no need for a comprehensive energy plan to begin the transition to clean energy because of natural gas and EPA regulations. We announced the plan in 2008. Initially, it was entirely internal. When our company was formed with the creation of with the merger of two other companies in 2001, our emissions of CO2, of carbon, were 15.7 million metric tons. Our goal in Exelon 2020 is to reduce, offset, or displace that entire carbon footprint by 2020. But what we have evolved into in this plan is more than a carbon reduction plan. It serves as our template for sensible energy policy by identifying reliable, affordable electric supply options that reduce pollution. Let me tell you how we're doing on our plan before I turn to that. We have already reduced our carbon footprint by 13 million tons, 83% of our goal, in the 4 years since we established the policy. We have retired 4 inefficient old fossil plants. We have increased our nuclear generating capacity, which is air emission free, by approximately 190 megawatts, and we'll increase it by another 1,100 megawatts in the next 5 years. We do that by recalibrating the instrumentation in our nuclear plants and making them more powerful. We have reduced energy use in our commercial buildings by 25%. We have added 90 megawatts to our wind portfolio in 2011 alone, built the largest solar plant, urban solar plant in the West Pullman neighborhood outside of Chicago, and acquired a 235 megawatt solar plant under construction in California. We have helped our customers avoid more than 728,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually through our energy efficiency programs. So what we have done internally is we've said there are ways to do more with less. There are ways to be cleaner with less. There are ways to address carbon. And carbon and the other particulates that are subject to the EPA regulations are different beings, but generally the policies that affect one will affect the other one, at least directionally, in very much the same way. So what we have done now as this has evolved is each year we develop a supply curve to show the costs of various technologies taking into account current market conditions. In the past, this curve has been focused primarily on options for reducing greenhouse gases, but in 2011 we expanded the curve to include options for reducing other pollutants, NOx, SOx, and the toxics. And then we modeled 4 scenarios for PJM, which is essentially the region that we operate in. And the PJM region essentially goes from here to from here in Illinois all the way to the East Coast. And we looked at what the supply chain is like in that area and what it is likely to be like in the future. And I'm going to identify for you 4 different scenarios that we used. In each scenario, just to explain this, the horizontal axis right here represents generation in terawatt hours. The width of each bar, and you'll see each bar corresponds to something that can be done to supply electricity, additional electricity, or to reduce the demand for electricity. The width of each bar in this scenario reflects the reliability implications of the particular technology that is reflected. So for example, where you have intermittent technologies such as wind, which runs 30 or 40% of the time, in order to get the same impact, it's going to have to be a wider bar than it would be to increase the productivity out of a nuclear plant. But what this essentially shows, the bars go to the right to show what will need to happen in the next decade, and I'll explain what the sweet spot means in a second, to reach Clean Air Act compliance and also ensure reliability as these coal plants retire. What are the things that have to be done and what do they cost? The vertical axis over here is what we call over here where you see 2008 for megawatt dollars, okay, is the levelized costs of energy. And what this is, it's a little complicated, and I'm not an economist, so I don't understand this as well as some of the people in the room. But what it is, in essence, is a metric that's used in the power industry to compare the total cost of generation by technology. So it takes into account cost effectiveness of generation, construction costs, the fuel costs, the operating costs, the taxes, return on capital. It makes some adjustments to be able to translate so that it can be compared to today's wholesale prices. And it says basically what price has to be realized for the technology at issue to be justified to build. So in other words, if you look here, what we have here is today's prices. And in these various technologies, we have nuclear uprates here. Nuclear uprates can be built profitably and get a return on capital if the prices go down to this level, down here. If you look over here and we have coal to gas switching, that is in essence conversion so that you take coal plants and have gas plants make the same productivity, you're going to have prices that are slightly above today's prices. And if you go over here and look at a new CCGT, that's a gas plant, it's in approximately the same way. And then as you get on out, you see some of the more expensive items, which are onshore wind. There are a couple of columns of that. And the important item here is this line, the subsidy line. Remember, I told you how much subsidies cost. This is the actual cost. This is the full cost of putting these into the stack. This is the cost when we've paid the subsidies. So once you've made a payment, you essentially reduce the technical cost down to this level of the wind, but the real cost, including the subsidies that taxpayers have to pay for, is much, much higher. Now, in this scenario, the sweet spot, what this shows is the oldest, least efficient, biggest polluting coal and oil-fired plants retire due to the economics of cheap natural gas and the cost of installing long overdue emission controls. The power that is lost in these plants is replaced. This is the replacement of those power by existing gas plants which are running below full capacity, by nuclear uprates, that's the enhancement in the nuclear provisions, and energy efficiency in large part. So you have energy efficiency, which is this color, make up the remainder of the retiring fossil capacities. Although coal retires, it's not killed. There will still be installation of coal, environmental controls. And what this shows is that with the exception of a few pieces here, the wind pieces here, the limited amount of wind, without all the subsidies, without all the special programs, without all the sexiness, if we have the Clean Air Act and the obligations under the Clean Air Act, and then we have the marketplace, rational players in the marketplace will do the least expensive thing. And this will be the thing that they do, provided that the market is undisturbed. Now, the ultimate pricing for this, the sweet spot price, is about 12 if you combine this in combination, is about 12 megawatts higher than where the market currently is trading in today's dollars. That is far, far less than the Natural Research Council's finding of the societal cost from NOx and SOx emissions and particulates, which they estimate to be $120 per megawatt hour for the dirtiest plants and the ones that we assume will shut down. Now, in addition to complying with the Clean Air Act, the sweet spot reduces carbon dioxide by 40 million tons from business as usual. The next scenario that we looked at in our analysis is what we call king coal. This assumes not the scenario that I described before, but it assumes that every coal plant, including those that would otherwise retire because they don't make economic sense, is retrofitted with scrubbers. In other words, we go all out to save coal. We say we're going to save coal in the United States, and how we're going to do it is we're going to subsidize through recovery and regulated rates the retrofitting of all of the coal plants. And so what essentially happens here is you get to the same place, but where you get to it, in large part, is through the coal retrofit. Now look and compare what the coal retrofit costs relative to the cost that we saw on the previous slide, where you just let the marketplace work for itself. It's a much greater cost, $100 a megawatt hour versus near-term forwards at PJM of $55 per megawatt hour. And keeping this generation online, this right here, which is what a lot of coal advocates say we should do, results in additional costs of about $1.5 billion per year for consumers. And while this does comply with the Clean Air Act, because you retrofit all of these, and the Clean Air Act doesn't currently cover CO2, carbon, it emits 30 million metric tons greater amount of carbon dioxide than the sweet spot that I showed you previously, which is the equivalent of putting 6 million additional cars on the road. The last two analyses that we looked at are what we call big wind and playing favors. And they examine and look at whether it's possible to clean up the generation fleet, in other words, meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act, without more environmental controls on coal and oil. Each of these scenarios assumes that EPA regulations are not in place, but that policymakers try to reach clean air goals of the regulations through other policy mechanisms, specifically a renewable portfolio standard in the first case, and a clean energy standard in the case of playing favorites. Now, if you look at big wind, which is what we call here, where all of the enhancement is done primarily through wind, you see the bandwidth of what is necessary here. And so the cost to consumers is the amount above this red line times the bandwidth, in essence. That's what the math is. Why is this bandwidth so much larger? Because to have reliable service, which remember is the premise of this analysis in all four scenarios, when do we need electricity the most? On hot summer days. What's the one thing that doesn't happen on hot summer days? The wind doesn't blow. And that is, in essence, the tension between wind, which is the prevailing and sexiest renewable policy, and what the reality is of what we need to reliably replace and enhance the generation slide within our communities and within our country. Big Wind advocates the subsidized construction of wind with the hope of either displacing or forcing the retirement of enough existing coal generation to meet clean air objectives. In other words, a 25% renewable electricity standard. Let me go down to the second one down here, which is where we have not abandoned all the other pieces, but we've put big wind in complement with a basket of technologies: solar, new nuclear, and clean coal. And one thing I want to emphasize here, because we are often criticized as a company that we are advocating against the renewable energy because we're a nuclear company and we're trying to protect our marketplace. We are the #1 company in the country in saying we don't need to build new nuclear in this country. New nuclear is way on the other side over here of the expense. It is in fact more expensive than the wind. And relative to what we can do with gas, what we can do with natural gas in its plentiful content, it doesn't make any sense to build this. Now, there are 2 new nuclear plants currently, units being built in Georgia by the Southern Company. And we are all rooting for those plants to be built well. The last generation of nuclear plants that were built in the United States came in at about 4 times budget on average and were a disaster for the first 10 or 15 years of their existence. We hope that won't happen with Southern. But why is Southern being able to build these plants? Because these plants are in a regulated environment where the rate base, they're part of the rate base. About half the company is deregulated, where they've taken the generation, they've said, you have to live or die on efficiency. You have to be good enough to survive. That's what Illinois is, that's what Pennsylvania is, that's where all the areas that we are in. That is the environment in which natural gas will flourish because it's the least expensive way to develop electricity. The reason they're building the plants in the Southern Company is because they're within rate base. So that means that as these plants are being developed, even though they are significantly higher price in terms of generation than is natural gas, that the consumers, the utility customers, will have to pay as the plants are developed. So Southern can afford to do this because their arrangement in that regulated world is that the regulators have essentially agreed, we will impose those costs on the consumers of electricity. So both of these pieces, the analysis shows that neither of these scenarios, by the way, would end up complying with the Clean Air Act. The SOx and toxic levels are much higher and come at a much higher cost to consumers. Big wind, the one on the top here, would cost consumers about $15 billion annually. That's about 325% increase over the sweet spot. And playing favorites would cost about $10 billion annually in excess of the sweet spot, a 285% increase. Now, although each of these scenarios reduces carbon 90 million tons more than the sweet spot, it comes at a greater cost to the consumer. $125 on average for big wind and $110 on average for playing favorites. And by the way, just to put this in comparison, the Waxman-Markey bill, which nearly passed, the piece that could have been comprehensive energy legislation, contemplated a cost on carbon of $15 to $25 per ton. Each scenario, although some coal retires, uncontrolled fossil generation remains in supply. The sweet spot, which allows the market to work within a frame of environmental regulation, in our view, is clearly the preferable scenario from a cost, reliability, and clean standard context. So this is how our analysis has evolved, looking internally at what are the things that we should invest in, looking for clean, reliable, and affordable energy for our customers. And we've evolved it into a thought process about what is out in the national front, what else in PJM, and we've extended this. What are the things that we should be doing from a policy standpoint? And the 2 conclusions we believe these charts that I've shown you compel are this. Number 1, there are cleaner and there are far less expensive ways to get to the proverbial finish line than the things that we're pursuing as the sexy projects. They just are there. That's that. And number 2, if you look at the way we've thought about the sexy projects, we've thought about the renewable energy, we've thought about all the other things that are a part of the dialogue that are gaining so much momentum, nobody's paying attention to what the cost is of these. And we have to think about as a country, if we're going to have a rational economic policy, not only the mix and not only what is sexy, but what will be incurred by the consumers ultimately. So I started off by mentioning all the things that we were large in other than nuclear. Our wind acquisitions, our solar acquisitions, our other renewable programs that we have. And you might ask, given these charts, why Exelon has invested in wind and solar over the past few years. Doesn't it seem inconsistent with what the sweet spot would say we should do? These charts tell you that as a general proposition, wind and solar are far from economic. So why would we do this as a company consistent with what our analysis shows? Well, the first thing I would say on this is this. We have looked at thousands of wind and solar projects across the company, thousands, that have only found a handful that could be done economically and provide our shareholders some return. So when it looks like we're the 11th largest wind producer in the company and say, well, this is willy-nilly relative to what you're telling us, we've looked, we have 35 people in our company that's all they do is look for projects of this nature that can be economic. And we found very few. They're economic, by the way, because of power purchase agreements that states have entered into where we have a guaranteed revenue stream for those projects, or because of tax credit circumstances. And those tax credits will be in question at the end of this year as the government looks for money. We've also invested in those technologies because we don't think the charts will always necessarily look like they look today. If you did these charts back in 2006 when natural gas was at $12, an BTU, the charts would look dramatically different than they do today. One of the things that I think we've learned from natural gas is there are things that will happen technologically that we can't contemplate. So we can't afford to as a company, and we can't afford to as a country, be completely myopic about the incredible attractiveness of natural gas. It doesn't make sense because we don't know everything that will happen. And our charts have looked very different over time. A few years ago, new nuclear was on the verge of being economic. We just don't have a crystal ball as to what future energy supplies will be like. And we do think these technologies will be a part of the future and that we should understand how they work. We do think that there is value in the diversity of fuel sources and preserving and encouraging the diversity of fuel sources. And we do think there will be technological developments that may very well render some of these technologies that are expensive far less expensive in the future. But my point is simply this. As part of the dialogue about those issues, as part of the consideration of should we have fuel diversity, should we have renewable in the magnitude that people are talking about, what should we do to encourage technology development? How much should we invest in technologies that are currently uneconomic in anticipation that somewhere along the line something good is going to happen in this technology that's going to change its economic reality? When we're making those considerations, when we're thinking about those issues as a country, we simply should not ignore the economics of the current policies. And that's the point of all this, is that we talk about renewables, we talk about new nuclear, we talk about all of these things as if price doesn't matter. And we're in an economically very constrained environment where price should be at the forefront of the discussion. So I'm not here to say, and our company doesn't say, we should not have renewable programs. As I said, we're deeply involved in them. I'm not here to say that all subsidies are bad. There are a number of subsidies that we're benefiting and our consumers are benefiting by. But what I'm here to say is we should have a very clear understanding as a matter of our national energy policy priorities and our national energy policy dialogue of the expense that is associated with things that look sexy. And if we do that, so that when we talk about wind and we talk about solar and when we talk about new nuclear, we're at least putting a relative price tag on it, then we're going to have a much better idea about what the long-term impact of the policies will be. We shouldn't pick the sexy technologies because they're sexy. We should pick the technologies that, in balance with the economic realities and in balance with all those technological considerations that will advance the ball, is the one that makes the most sense. So with that said, I'm delighted to have had the chance to talk about this. Our former chairman, and our chairman who had been in the industry for 28 years as a CEO, retired on Monday. He retired because we completed a transaction where we acquired another company, and his retirement was tied to that event. Our chairman is far more radical on this issue than a radical in terms of the sense of no subsidies than I think probably I've portrayed here. But here's an interesting contrast. He's the leading, absolute leading spokesperson in the industry, without question, on the carbon issue. In 1992, he was testifying before Congress on the dangers of carbon and global warming. So this is just not a capitalist trying to make a buck and saying, I want to preserve our stuff. This is a person, and this policy has evolved from a philosophy that says we do want to be a good company, we do want to be a profitable company, but we want to have rational policies underlying what's happening in our own development of generation, and we want to have rational policies underlying what the country does with the energy in the next generation. So thank you very much. I am pleased, Dr. Norton, to answer any questions or comment on this or anything else with respect to the industry that you would be interested in.
Thank you very much, Bill, for why don't we throw the discussion open for a few minutes? Anyone who would like to ask a question, go ahead and ask it. We'll do it orderly. I'll defer you to your judgment as to whom to call and when. So go right ahead.
Yes, sir. Well, and would you mind telling me who you are when to call upon you?
Jim Holtzman. I'm in the economics department here, but I've been looking at electric cars lately, and oil is a substitute, obviously, for electric in some ways. It turns out that, here's I can figure, a Nissan Leaf would be about 3 cents a mile on electricity, 11 cents, 12 cents on gasoline car. Isn't it, if there's a switch toward electric, two questions. One, do we have capacity to deal with a major switchover if it's getting rather quickly? And second, wouldn't that raise the price of electric so that a lot of the charts would change?
Well, what's interesting, electric cars are, let me just say in self-interest, there is nothing that we would like more than electric cars. We run nuclear plants. Nuclear plants we run 24/7, 93% of the year. So we're running those plants all the time. And just as how I talked about wind is not available when we need it most, nuclear energy is always available when we need it the least. So if we had a technology that would allow us to have cars plug in at night and take some of that load, we actually sell our load at night regularly at a loss. We pay people to take our electricity at night because there's so much oversupply relative to the nuclear plants. So we would love for that, just provincially, we'd love for that technology to occur. I think the real piece that is holding it back, in my understanding, and I'm not a scientist, but it's really the battery capacity that has been the limitation thus far, and the fact that you can't get that far in a car and you have to charge it for a relatively long period of time to do it. It really would change the dynamics, and on a petroleum basis as well as an electricity basis. And it would create additional demand, and there would be, I suspect, modest increases depending on how extensive the technology ended up being in electricity prices in general, but the offsetting benefits would be enormous. The one other thing I just want to say in that regard, and I said I wasn't going to talk about transportation, we have the ability now in this country to take all of the large trucks in this country and convert them to natural gas fuel. And if we did that, I mean, we could have an enormous impact. If you converted large vehicles in the United States to natural gas, which is not, technology is there, it's just a question of making the investment, we would save the amount of petroleum that we import from Saudi Arabia in any year, just by doing that with the large vehicles. So there is a natural gas opportunity. The larger opportunities for electricity depend on the development of the technology, the battery technology. And I think, by the way, that the next big thing, and our people who are much smarter than I am tell me the battery technology is not going to be here for 20 years or more. But when I think about how natural gas changed the environment, the next thing that could change the environment would be battery technology and storage. Yes, ma'am.
Bonnie Earhart, an alumni. With fracking coming on so strongly, and the fact that we're the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, will you be building more plants that use natural gas? On your charts, did you show where the natural gas generating plant would be price-wise?
Here's the, let me go back on the chart here for a second and show you. The green is the CCGT, okay? And so CCGT is a combined cycle gas turbine is what that stands for. So that's a gas plant. And you can see it's modestly above today's forwards. The reason you would not build more natural gas plants here, the reason we have the wind pieces here, is this is wind that has to be built to comply with existing law. Okay, so the existing law says between now and 2018, you've got to have this much wind to meet the renewable portfolio standards. If we didn't have those standards, you would go right across here in green. Okay, so that's why you have it. But what we believe, if the market is allowed to play out, you would have enormous development of natural gas. The reason you don't have it here is you still have a few things that are less expensive than natural gas. The coal to gas switch, meaning running the gas plants more often than they do, they're at lower capacities, energy efficiency, nuclear uprates. But ultimately, this indicates what we've got to get to by the end of the decade to have enough supply. Right now, the economy is really suppressing the demand for electricity. As you get out into the decades and you get more demand and you get greater retirement of existing plants, we think that the green bars, the reason I have all the jobs that were described and am not permitted to turn a switch on and off in a plant should be evident to all of you, right, at the moment, is that gas would be the future. Now, there'll have to be some additional infrastructure built within the country to do that. The gas prices in Europe are still 3 times as much as they are in the United States. Eventually, we may export gas, as the large producer, just as just as oil is exported from the Middle East. But those bars, as we need to build more, will be much greater unless what we do is make this required by statute or regulation or renewable portfolio standard. And then you're not going to build the gas because you've got to do that. You don't have any choice. To comply with the law, that's required. Yes?
I'm Katie, and I'm a junior here at Wheaton, and I'm a geology major. In light of last year with the Japanese nuclear meltdown from the tsunami, how has that affected the view of nuclear power and its affordability, and how do you think it will affect it in the long term?
I'm going to repeat a couple of things here in answering your question that Abby and JD have already heard, so just to give you a sense of this. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the governing body, the government body which governs the nuclear plants, has put together a series of recommendations out of Fukushima that are in development. So there are 3 tranches of recommendations, one of which will go into effect in the next year, and then there will be longer periods of time as these are tested and reviewed by the appropriate stakeholders. We don't think those regulations are going to appreciably change the cost of nuclear. We think they will be marginal increases in the cost of nuclear. Now, one might, in hearing that, say, how can that be when Fukushima happened? Are we being irresponsible as a country by not requiring more? And the fact is that our plants are operated at so much higher safety level than the Japanese plants that when the NRC came with all the political pressure from Fukushima, did their first 30-day review, the first thing out of their mouths, and these are people who have politics on their mind, the first thing out of their mouths was, our plants in the United States are safe. So the enhancements that are going to be required are marginal enhancements. They're not going to be enhancements that are going to be game changers about whether one would build or not build nuclear energy. But the fact is that nuclear energy, which is over here, is significantly higher in price than gas, whether Fukushima or not. And what is going to deter nuclear development, absent subsidies for nuclear, and there's a lot of popularity. We have really smart people in Congress who say we should build 100 new nuclear plants without regard to what that would cost the country. But in the absence of Fukushima, without regard to that, you're not going to do this if you have an economically rational policy and you let the marketplace take place, because you'll build gas plants instead. Did that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Yes, ma'am. I'll go right to left.
My name is Kate. I'm a senior studying economics here. I thought your comment was interesting that you agree with some subsidies but not others. Could you give your criteria for what you think are the good subsidies and what are bad ones?
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying, was it Kate? I'm sorry? Yeah, Kate. I think what I'm saying is I don't know that I'm in a position to select what are the best subsidies or not, and we have a lot of people who spend a lot of time thinking about that. What I meant to say, and I probably wasn't precise, is I'm in favor of some level of subsidies to ensure that we're staying in touch with technological development, but not at the level that we are doing it now, where we're completely distorting the marketplace. So the thing that would logically be the criteria, I think, for subsidies is, well, let me give you an example. What would really be practical? Let's compare wind and solar, for example. Now, we talked previously about how wind doesn't generate electricity when you most need it. Solar generates electricity when you most need it. Solar, you have the most rapidly decreasing costs associated with the technology, where it can become more viable faster than wind can become viable in the absence of storage, which would be a huge positive for wind. So one would look at that and say, okay, if we're picking and choosing and we're going to reduce the size of subsidies, maybe we focus on solar more than we do on wind. So those are the kind of judgments that have to be made. But my comment was really intended more to the magnitude rather than the particular kind. Sir? Yeah.
Chuck Graham, just an area resident. In response to the question about Japan, are the Germans just way overreacting by phasing out of the power generation?
You know, technologically, yes. Politically, I don't purport to understand what they're going to do. I don't think they're going to open any. There are only 2 remaining plants open in Japan, and they're going to close those, it looks like. Germany's going to close all of theirs within 20 years. I think it's more of a political piece, and I would say it's an overreaction. We don't know whether Europe is going to have the kind of gas capacity the United States has. And the thing is, once a nuclear plant is built, once it's built and operating, it's the lowest marginal cost power available. We run nuclear plants. Nuclear plants cost almost nothing to run relative to any other kind of energy once they're constructed. So what Germany will have to face in doing this, and Germany has not had any unusual safety problems relative to Japan or other areas. So there doesn't appear to be any evidence that there's some additional exposure there, safety exposure there, that would prompt this. But they'll have a tough time figuring out how to replace that power at prices that will be commensurate with the prices that it's produced in the nuclear plants. Yes, sir.
Jim Leffler alone. From a business standpoint, which one of these segments tends to be the most profitable?
Well, the profit is the greatest that creates the greatest delta between whatever the price line is and whatever the cost is. So if you look back, let me go back one here. So if you look down here and you see nuclear uprates, and just to give you an idea, we're spending to create about 1,100 megawatts in our nuclear plants. We're going to spend about $4.4 billion in enhancing equipment and making it better. That's going to be a huge potential profit for us. And you can see the difference between the forward prices that we receive today and what the cost is of doing the nuclear uprates. You see some of the uprates are more expensive than the other uprates. So that's a piece of it. We constantly look at the rate of return on the uprates as the prices have dropped dramatically for power, and our uprate plan has been in effect since 2010. We're constantly looking and saying, does it still make sense? And the financial people come back every time and say it makes great sense. So I would say, in answer to your question, that's the best piece. Obviously, energy efficiency has a lot of bang for its buck. To a certain degree, you get into their energy efficiency programs that are easy, and then there are those that are more expensive.
Jim Clark from Geology. Yeah, you mentioned, and I think this is great, that some of the alternative energies are best in different places. Like wind would be good in North Dakota, and solar would be good in Arizona, or something like this. Are you investing at all in increased transmission, power lines, and that sort of thing, which would perhaps help some of the alternative?
Well, these costs right here account for transmission that would be necessary to develop it. So there is, on the drawing board, a huge transmission line that would take the, kind of in that corridor that you're talking about, that wind corridor, the Dakotas, Nebraska, that would bring that energy into the Midwest. It's a multi-billion dollar cost to do that. But a lot is being looked at as part of that. And no one has gotten approval to do that, but the transmission would clearly have to be a part. And these costs reflect what we believe the transmission costs would be. What these costs don't reflect is what's the cost of building the peaking, and by peaking are facilities that only run sporadically. So we have three kinds of facilities. One is base load, that's the nuclear plants that run all the time, or the coal plants, a lot of coal plants that run all the time. Mid-merit, which will run about half the time, and then peaking. We have peaking facilities, they're oil facilities. This last year we didn't run a single day, but because there wasn't a need for it, therefore when there's a particularly heightened requirement. What this doesn't take into account, because we can't quantify with precision what's going to retire, is how much more expense is going to be incurred by building right next to the wind plants that can go on a moment's notice in order to bring to the marketplace the electricity that is being counted on from wind that operates in the areas you're talking about, Jim, at maybe 40% capacity, and in less attractive areas, or 45%, less attractive areas, 20 or 25% capacity. So it's a big issue with wind. Yes, sir.
What's the projection on how much natural gas will be used to fuel, what the percentage is going to be to generate electricity, and what will that do to the cost of natural gas?
Well, the projection depends on the policies. It obviously depends on the policies. And what is developed and what happens with the rest of these things. Our folks tell us that if we converted so that natural gas at spot now is $2.25 or $2.29 today, that is influenced by a couple of things, including the enormously warm winter that we had across the entire country. So the gas reserves are overflowing, literally and figuratively. But if you looked at where we expected gas to be, at this time, we probably expected it to be more in the $4 range a year ago rather than the $2.25 range. If you made a massive conversion to natural gas in the United States, given the supply, assuming the technology is what we believe the technology would be, you'd get up to, in today's dollars, probably $6 gas. So maybe $6.50 gas, but that's really just taking out everything and making it all gas. That's not enough to even remotely get you in these neighborhoods in terms of cost. Anything else? We have one more up here. I'm sorry, sir. I apologize. I didn't see you.
My name is Riley.
I'm sorry, Riley?
Riley, I'm a senior student here. You seem to allude to the fact that right now the most economical options may not be the most renewable. Do you see a time in the future where that could change, and what would be the things that would lead to that?
The big game changer would be storage. If you could run wind farms at night and store that electricity and keep it for the heat of the day, that would have a real impact. There's other technological things that are happening with solar right now that are making them far more efficient, not dependent as much on storage, but storage would be the huge game changer for wind in particular. And you know, right now, and we spent a lot of time looking at this, we don't think there's going to be a viable storage alternative for a long, long period of time. It's analogous to the battery storage thing that you alluded to before, but in terms of massive storage so that wind could become a reliable base load provider of electricity, the big ticket item is storage, and we're a long, long, long way away from being able to do that technology. Now, if any of you young scientists can come up with that, then you're going to be able to have your own island and probably your own country.
Bill, thank you very much.